So our next speaker is Kathryn Hanson. We're really excited, again, as a part of this panel this morning to kind of fulfill that nutrition piece of it as well. Ms. Hanson, she's a registered dietitian. She's also a certified nutritionist. And she's been a clinical dietitian at our flagship hospital here at IU for almost 5 years. She actually has a real special focus on GI and hepatobiliary disease in patients. So I think we're in for a real treat for her perspective. A nutritionist is probably one of the underutilized pieces of my armament in my practice, so it's one of the reasons I actually invited her to come. So thank you, Ms. Hanson.
Thank you. Yes, again, my name is Kathryn Hanson, and I'm a clinical dietitian over at University Hospital. I've worked there for 4 years now, and my focus is primarily GI disorders, one being liver disease, so it's a huge passion of mine. So I'm very excited to be here today. So some of the topics that I want to discuss with you are many things that I talk about with my patients on a day-to-day basis. Those include nutrition misconceptions, common things that people read about or hear about, that I hear about all the time, nutrition complications as a result of liver disease, calorie and protein goal recommendations, and then various diet recommendations, which those would include low sodium, gluten restricted, anti-inflammatory, FODMAP, low residue, and lactose free. In addition, we'll talk about fluid restrictions, oral supplementation, vitamin supplementation, and then also herbal supplements. So common nutrition misconceptions that I hear about from my patients include restricting protein, avoiding meat, necessarily having to follow a low sodium diet or restricting fluids, and then having this idea that there is some perfect diet that's going to fix their liver. So as far as restricting protein goes, this is something that I hear all the time, is that I'm not allowed to eat protein. So this was kind of an old school thought that restricting protein would help with hepatic encephalopathy or confusion, which can happen with advanced liver disease. Many of my patients struggle with this as a result of their liver disease. But now we have several medications that we use primarily to help with this as a first line of support, and we no longer recommend restricting protein. Restricting protein is basically a last resort option if you were to be refractory to all other treatments to help with your hepatic encephalopathy. Restricting protein is not necessarily shown to even provide any benefit at all to hepatic encephalopathy. And in reality, what you're really doing is just furthering breaking down your muscles and escalating your malnutrition. So that is one I definitely do not recommend that people do. The second is avoiding meat. So avoiding meat, again, as a means to restrict their protein intake. But in reality, what I recommend is trying to eat lean sources of protein, such as chicken, poultry, pork, and fish, and then restricting red meat into their diet. Typically, I recommend restricting the red meat because it's higher in cholesterol, and one of the functions of your liver is to help regulate cholesterol levels. So that would be the reasoning behind limiting your red meat intake. And then following a low sodium diet and restricting fluids. These two together are things we recommend if you're having any problems with fluid accumulation, also known as ascites, which is fluid accumulation on the abdomen, or edema in any of your extremities. So we typically recommend this only if you're, again, refractory to other medications that are used to help you with your fluid accumulation. So if this is indeed the case for you, then we may put you on a certain fluid restriction, which the doctor would decide what that would be, and then a low sodium diet, which again, usually the doctor would decide what that would be. And then the last thing is having the idea that there's some certain good or perfect diet that's going to fix your liver for you. Unfortunately, with nutrition, there is no one-size-fits-all scenario. Everybody is very different, and everyone's medical history is so different that my nutrition recommendations are tailored from person to person. So really taking a look at the recommendations that I'm going to give you during this presentation and trying to fit that into your own personal history would be my best recommendation. So with that being said, some nutrition complications that I typically see with my patients are early satiety, decrease in appetite, taste changes, general fatigue, nausea or vomiting, decreased intake, and then also vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So with going forward, calorie and protein goals for my patients. I do want to reiterate that these are adult protein and calorie recommendations. They are not for pediatric populations. So if you were to have pediatric questions, I would strongly recommend that you seek out a pediatric dietitian who is adequately trained in that specific population. So adult calorie goals, anywhere from 20 to 35 calories per kilogram of body weight. Again, depending on your energy expenditure, depending on how active you are, that kind of thing. So anywhere in that range. Protein goals, anywhere from 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And these protein goals would change if you have any type of renal dysfunction. So I've seen that happen with patients with advanced liver disease. They may have some renal dysfunction as a result. So if that is the case for you, then these protein goals would be different for you. And I would recommend seeking out a renal dietitian for those recommendations. The weights that I typically use to calculate energy needs are either going to be your actual or your most current body weight if you don't have any fluid accumulation. If there's fluid accumulation present, I typically recommend using your ideal body weight, which I use based off of your height. So it's called the Hamway method. So for men, you're going to start off at 106 pounds for 5 feet, and you're going to add 6 pounds for every inch above that. And for women, you're going to start off at 100 pounds for 5 feet and add 5 pounds for every inch above that. And for your reference, 1 kilogram is going to be 2.2 pounds. So if you're wanting to know how to make that conversion, that's there for you. Big thing I recommend is small, frequent meals. This is helpful if you're having nausea or vomiting or decreased appetite. Smaller, more frequent meals are more appetizing when you look at them. So if you're having nausea, sometimes it's helpful to have a smaller amount in front of you and eat that slower versus some big meal sitting in front of you. That's not as appetizing. And also easier for the body to digest and absorb the food when it's in small, frequent portions that way. So going into the diets, first is low sodium. So as I said earlier, typically this diet is only recommended if you're having uncontrolled fluid accumulation that's been refractory to medications. So if that's the case for you, typically what we will do is put our patients on a 2 gram or 2,000 milligram or 3,000 milligram sodium restriction. 2 gram versus 3 gram, it might depend on how much fluid you have building up that's the most restrictive would typically go. Main points with this diet are going to be just getting rid of the salt shaker altogether. So if you're a person like me, I tend to like my salt. It's best just to get rid of the salt shaker altogether and not have that as a temptation. Because a little salt goes a long way. Just to put it in perspective, 1 teaspoon of salt is 2,300 milligrams of sodium. So when you say I'm just adding a little bit here and a little bit there, you really have no idea how much you're really adding to your food and how much sodium you're really taking in. So big thing is getting rid of the salt shaker. Second thing is trying to avoid prepackaged, canned, and processed foods. Those are going to be loaded with salt just because they're using the salt as a preservative. So they're trying to increase the shelf life of their product. So those would be ones that we would want you to avoid. Now, understandably, if canned food items are your only option from a financial standpoint or just wherever you live, that's most convenient, then I typically recommend you take that canned food item, you pour it in a colander, you rinse off the food and let it drain. That way, at least you're getting the majority of the salt off of your food, and then you can proceed to cook it from there. Big thing is trying to consume more fresh or frozen products that don't have any added sauces or seasonings to them. So as I always say, sticking to the outer food aisles of your grocery store are going to be your best bet. The inner aisles are not your friend. That's where you're going to find all your prepackaged foods, all your canned foods. But the outer aisles are where you're going to see all your fresh products and some of your frozen products that don't have any added sauces and seasoners. So I just put together here a table for you. There's a lot of information on here, so I'm sorry if it's kind of hard to read, but it just goes over each food group and the foods that we would recommend you avoid and the foods we'd recommend you consume in your diet. So real quickly going down the line, with fruits, I don't typically put any restrictions on those because they don't have any added salt into them by nature, unless you're using a salt shaker. So unless you're doing that, then you're good to go in the fruit department. With vegetables, as I already said, ones to avoid are going to be your canned and your prepackaged vegetables with added sauces and seasonings. As long as they're plain and you're not adding any salt of any kind to it, then you're going to be fine. With your meat products, recommend you stay away from prepackaged deli meats, bacon, sausage, bologna, cured meats, potted meat, pastrami, pepperoni, etc. Okay, trying to make sure you're getting fresh meat products or frozen with no added sauces or seasonings. With your dairy products, wanting to avoid salted butter, whole cream, cottage cheese, buttermilk, nacho cheese, and processed cheeses such as American, Cheese Whiz, and Velveeta. Grain products, big things are going to be your boxed items, like your boxed pre-made rices and your instant potatoes, your biscuits, your pastries, and your pancake and muffin mixes. Those are going to have a lot of added sodium to them. Snacks, any salted snacks such as nuts, popcorn, chips, peanut butter, crackers. As long as you're getting the unsalted version of those, then those are going to be fine. Condiments are a big one. Soy sauce, ketchup, pickles, relish, barbecue sauce. Those are going to have a lot of salt in them. So trying to look for the ones that have no added salt or low sodium versions are going to be your best bet for those. Some things, however, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You know, pickles, relish, anything pickled is by nature going to be high in salt, so it's just off the table. Seasonings wise, again, anything that's salt free. So getting rid of regular table salt, kosher salt, sea salt, garlic salt, onion salt, etc. Those things are going to be no-nos. So I get the question a lot about sea salt and kosher salt. The only real difference between regular table salt and sea salt is that sea salt is not iodized, but it still is very high in sodium. So that is one we still recommend you take off the table. So gluten restricted, this is a big one. Given that you have an autoimmune disease, you are at risk for having celiac disease or a gluten sensitivity. So if you're feeling like you may have symptoms with gluten sensitivity, I recommend asking your physician to actually test you for that and see if you do have a sensitivity or celiac disease. If this is indeed the case for you, the main thing that I recommend is avoiding wheat, barley, rye, and all their derivatives, malt, and oats that are not labeled as gluten-free, and any brewer's yeast. Okay, so gluten is a protein that is found in most of your grains, and if you have a gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, this is basically going to be damaging the lining of your intestine and causing you a lot of discomfort. So, and some of those things you may be experiencing gas, bloating, nausea, any of those things. So for a food to actually be labeled as gluten-free, the FDA requires that it contain no more than 20 parts per million of gluten. So if you see that something is gluten-free labeled, then it is FDA approved and safe for you to use. Again, with, like I said earlier, focusing on the outer aisles of your grocery store is going to be your best bet for finding gluten-free items. Inner aisles are going to be much trickier, and it's going to be harder for you to be able to decipher what foods are going to be gluten-free or not, unless they are labeled as such. And big strong point is just because it's wheat-free does not necessarily mean that it's gluten-free. So always reading your labels very carefully, reading the ingredient list to make sure you know what's in your food and whether or not you should be avoiding it. Anti-inflammatory. So I've had this question a lot as well. What kinds of foods are going to be helpful if you're having some inflammation? Typically, I recommend eating more of the omega-3 fatty acids, which are going to be your fish oil, your salmon, mackerel, sardines, avocados, extra virgin olive oil, and tuna. Natural herbs and spices, as was said earlier, garlic, ginger, and turmeric are good ones to help you with your inflammation. And then your deep yellow, green, red, orange fruits and vegetables. Carrots, spinach, broccoli, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, bell peppers are just some examples of those. And then getting enough fiber in your diet. So ground flaxseed, walnuts, pine nuts, almonds, and pistachios are some good examples of getting that extra fiber into your diet. What we don't want you to eat are going to be your trans and hydrogenated fats, your refined oils such as canola oil, safflower, and corn oil, processed foods, as we said earlier, and then the red meat. FODMAP diet. So this is kind of a newer diet that's been starting. It's called fermentable oligosaccharides, which means few sugars or more than 2 sugars, disaccharides, 2 sugars, monosaccharides, 1 sugar, and polyols, which is sugar alcohols. So we typically indicate this for functional gastrointestinal diseases or irritable bowel syndrome. So I saw some people that raised their hands that have irritable bowel syndrome. This is kind of a newer diet that we've been trialing on some patients to see if this can help them with their symptoms. So FODMAPs in nature are sugars that are found in some foods. Not all of your carbohydrates are considered FODMAPs. So the ones that we consider FODMAPs are fructose, lactose, fructooligosaccharides, galactose oligosaccharides, sorbitol, mannitol, xylitol, and maltitol, which is your sugar alcohols. Okay? The foods that do not contain carbohydrates are not included in this diet. So that would be eggs, fish, poultry, meat, turkey, hard cheeses, butters, and oils. Those are going to be excluded from this diet. Okay? And then high fructose corn syrup. I'm sure a lot of people know about high fructose corn syrup. You hear about it in commercials a lot. As it relates to FODMAP diet, it's kind of 50-50. It's made up of half glucose and half fructose, so it may not affect everybody the same. Some people may have a very hard time with it and have to exclude it altogether, whereas some people may be able to have it in very small quantities. So I recommend if you're going to want to try it, just try it in very small quantities to determine your tolerance level to it. One thing that can help you with starting this diet if you're considering it is to have a hydrogen breath test. So a hydrogen breath test can help you to determine if you have a lactose, a fructose, or a sucrose intolerance. So if you want to make sure you know right offhand what you might already be intolerant to, having a hydrogen breath test is the easiest way. It's a quick, easy test that you can have done, so you can ask your physician about that. The nice thing about doing that is then you'll already know you can rule out those 3 things, or you'll know, okay, I'm already intolerant to them, so I know I need to exclude them from my diet. So it can be very helpful when you're starting the diet to know what is necessary to exclude and what is not. Okay. So steps to the diet. Again, I said the hydrogen breath test, and then always referral to a dietitian before you're starting the diet. This diet is very, very restrictive. It has an actual process to it in which you eliminate foods and then reintroduce foods. So you really want to make sure that you seek out a dietitian who understands the diet, has a lot of experience with the diet, and can help coach you through the process. And I definitely would be cautious with the diet if you're already struggling with poor intake, severe weight loss, malnutrition, as this will only exacerbate that because you're restricting quite a few foods from your diet. So I'm always very cautious with this diet and taking into account, my patient's medical history first. So, typically, the FODMAP diet is a 6-week long process where you will slowly take away foods and then reintroduce them in a certain order. And again, it's a slow reintroduction of each food group. So it is a long process. Here is a map, or basically a FODMAP, that tells you what is going to be high in FODMAPs and what's going to be low in FODMAPs. So I won't go through every single one with you, but it basically lays out, each part of the diet, and then ones that you'll have to avoid, take out of your diet, and the ones that are safe for you to keep in your diet. So as you can see, it's a pretty black and white list of foods. So there's really no ifs, ands, or buts about it. This is the way the diet works, and these are the foods you have to take into consideration. So low residue and lactose free. I included these diets because these are more of diets that I would recommend for patients who are struggling with flare-ups of their disease. So if you're having, a flare-up of your irritable bowel syndrome, or even with your gluten sensitivity, I might recommend being put on this diet until your symptoms resolve. So during the flare, we would recommend these diets, and then as the symptoms resolve, we recommend slow reintroduction of these food items. So a low residue diet is basically a fancy word for low fiber diet. I recommend this if you're having any problems with strictures, narrowing, or a bowel obstruction. So main points of it are avoiding high fiber foods, including foods with skins, seeds, pulp, whole grain products, raw vegetables, beans, nuts, corn, peas, raisins, popcorn, and bran and fiber supplements. Lactose-free diet. Again, if you've had the hydrogen breath test, you may already know if you're lactose intolerant or not. But if you don't, some of the problems that you may encounter would be gas, bloating, diarrhea, and cramping anytime you ingest foods that are high in lactose, which in a minute you'll be able to see a table with the foods that are highest in lactose. Main points: avoiding cow's milk, ice cream, yogurt, some cheeses, cream, butter, and cottage cheese. And for a lot of people, I find, again, this is really a person-to-person basis. Some people have to have complete exclusion of these food items, whereas some people tell me they can tolerate small quantities, up to a half a cup or a cup per day of some of these food items. So again, it may be more trial and error for you to determine what you best tolerate. So here is a long list of lactose-containing foods. I'm just going to point out the big ones, again being milk, buttermilk, fat-free dry milk, goat's milk, and then your ice cream and your cottage cheeses. So those are going to be the big ones that I would recommend you avoid. And then fluid restriction. So again, as I said earlier, fluid restriction is really only meant for those with uncontrolled ascites or edema that have been refractory to other medical means. So the actual amount of your fluid restriction will be determined by your physician. I've seen anywhere from 500 milliliters per day all the way up to 3 or 4 liters per day. So it just depends on how severe is your fluid accumulation, and also looking at your sodium levels to see, what kind of restriction you're going to need to be on. So there are foods that count as liquid. So as I always say, if it's liquid at room temperature, it's a liquid. So that would be, examples: gelatin, soup, custards, puddings, gravies, popsicles, etc. Those would be examples. Or if they contain a high quantity of water by nature, or if they contain a lot of liquid by nature. So those are some examples of some foods that would technically be considered liquids. And then measuring your liquids. So here's a nice table of different measurements, so that when you're trying to follow the diet, you know exactly how much you're actually getting into your total day. So it breaks it down into milliliters, and then how many teaspoons and tablespoons, and then up to liters that you'll be getting from certain amounts of liquids. And then measuring your foods. So knowing, okay, I had this food, how much liquid am I actually getting from that? So some examples are the juices in the puddings. They tell you a half a cup is going to be about 120 milliliters or 4 ounces of fluid. So that would be really important for you to know if you're on a fluid restriction. Again, it talks about fruit and ice chips, popsicles, soda, and milkshakes. Exactly how much are you getting in terms of fluid? And then oral supplements. So oral supplements are something I deal with on a day-to-day basis because, like I said, a lot of my patients, they don't have much of an appetite. They have early satiety, so getting their calories in and their protein in every day is sometimes very, very difficult. So that's where the oral supplements become very helpful for me, as these are a means to help you meet the remaining calorie and protein needs that you have with, in addition to what you're eating. So they are by no means meant to be a meal replacement. replacement. They are merely meant to be consumed in addition to what you're already eating to help you meet your calorie needs. So I cannot stress that enough. Some people tend to want to use these as, helpful for diets and losing weight, when in reality they're meant for the opposite purpose. So some examples of some oral supplements that I've used are Boost, Boost Plus, Ensure, Ensure Plus, Boost Breeze, Ensure Clear, Carnation Breakfast Essentials, and then any generic brands, such as Walmart. They have one called Equate, which is the exact same thing as an Ensure or a Boost, same calorie and protein content, but might be a little bit cheaper for you. So most of these supplements can be purchased commercially at any, grocery store or Walgreens or a CVS. Some of them, like the Ensure Clear and the Boost Breeze, they might be a little bit trickier to find. You can always go online to Nestle.com or to Abbott.com, and you can find these supplements, or you can simply Google them and you'll be able to find them very easily. But most of them you should be able to find in most grocery stores, so they're widely available. And then vitamin supplementation. So as I said earlier, if you have liver disease, you're already predisposed to some vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And then also if you're struggling with eating well, then you're already increasing your risk of being vitamin or mineral deficient. So big ones that I laid out here, zinc is a big one. Most of my patients are taking zinc supplementation. Zinc is essential during some metabolic pathways that occur in your liver. So for that purpose, if you're having any type of liver problems, it can be low as a result of that. Zinc has been shown to help with hepatic encephalopathy in some cases. So this is one that I use quite often for my patients. And this is also one too, if you're struggling with taste or smell changes at all, you may be at risk for a zinc deficiency. So if things are just tasting odd or off to you or don't have the right taste, it may be worthwhile having your zinc level checked and seeing if you need some additional supplementation. But I always wanted to be cautious with zinc supplementation, because if you are taking too much or taking zinc for a long period of time, it can cause a copper deficiency. So wanting to be very careful with your supplementation and having your levels checked periodically to determine, the length that you'll need the supplementation. Vitamin E is a big one. It's a powerful antioxidant. It may improve your liver enzymes, and it naturally may also be low in liver disease. So, and also with bowel diseases, if you're struggling with diarrhea or any type of fat malabsorption, vitamin E is a fat-soluble vitamin, and it can be low in some cases. So, it may be worthwhile having your vitamin E level checked to determine what your level is, and then having an appropriate dosage, a supplementation from there. Vitamin D is also a huge big one. Maybe low in liver disease, just as a result of the fact that liver is where vitamin D is activated into its final form, or most active circulating form. So it may be low for that reason. And also if you're taking any prednisone. Prednisone is very hard on your bones, and it can cause a vitamin D deficiency. So I highly recommend, if these are issues for you, then you have your vitamin D level checked. And also too, if you're lactose intolerant and you're not taking in a lot of dairy products, then that also puts you at further risk for a vitamin D deficiency. And then finally, calcium, which can be low as a result, again, of a vitamin D deficiency, or if you're taking prednisone as well. So having that level checked as well, and sometimes taking a combined vitamin D and calcium supplement is beneficial. So dosages, I didn't put them on here. Dosages for supplementation, I didn't put them on here because it really may vary on what your actual vitamin level is and your medical history and what medications you're taking. So recommend having your vitamin levels checked first, and then discussing with your physician what an appropriate dosage might be depending on what your level is. So very important to do that. The idea of more is good is not the case with vitamins. Especially with your fat-soluble vitamins, you can get toxicity as they're stored in your fat versus like calcium and zinc, they're excreted in your urine, so there's not as increase of a risk of toxicity, but wanting to be careful with how much you're supplementing and for how long, because like I said, you can get a toxicity. And then herbal supplements. So this was touched on already a little bit, also called dietary supplements. They're more regulated as a food versus a drug, so they're not FDA approved. So meaning you really don't know always what they're having effect, how they're affecting your liver and the rest of your body for that matter. So they're making claims, that they may not be able to make. So just want to be very cautious with supplements, and always talking to your physician before taking any type of herbal supplements. An example that I have is Simlerin, which is also milk thistle. This has been shown to have, or thought to have, hepatoprotective, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and anti-fibrotic effects. So there's not a lot of data to support milk thistle with liver disease, although I've had patients who take it. But again, with any herbal supplement, I would highly recommend that you talk to your physician before you start taking it, because you just don't know how it can affect your liver. And as was said earlier, how it'll affect your liver and causing, advanced liver disease is a risk that I personally wouldn't want any of you to take. And so basically, I've listed out some resources here for you, because most times, the thing you need to know the most is just where to get accurate information. With nutrition, it's really hard to have objectives and set goals because everybody's so different. So there is no one-size-fits-all scenario. So a lot of times just being able to know where to go to get your information is the key, and knowing who to ask. And as I said earlier, a registered dietitian is going to be your best bet. This is our job, this is our passion, this is what we love to do. And so trying to seek out a registered dietitian, or if you're not able to do that, then being able to visit some of the resources that I've provided for you. These are all reputable and science-based and evidence-based resources at your disposal. So with that said, I thank you so much.